Thank you for joining us today for this Whittier Trust webinar in collaboration with Pacific Council on International Policy. I'm Nicole Hale. We're excited to provide exclusive access to Dr. Jerrold D, President and CEO of the Pacific Council on International Policy, as he speaks to us about the geopolitics of the unfolding tragedy in Ukraine. We want to give you the opportunity to get your questions answered, so we will reserve time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. You may enter your questions at any time in the Q&A box located in the top right corner of your screen. I'll now hand it over to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Nicole. I want to bid everyone a good morning. I want to thank David Dahl and the rest of Team Whittier for inviting me to speak. And as Nicole says, we will leave ample time at the end for questions. This is such a fluid, dynamic, volatile situation that things are constantly changing, and so I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. What we're witnessing unfolding in front of us is an epic tragedy with ominous implications. It's almost defies both description and imagination. This is the first land war in Europe since World War II. And what's so tragic about this is A, this is a war that didn't have to happen, and B, there will be no winner here. There is no winner. Russia will not be able to conquer Ukraine, nor should it, and it certainly will not be able to occupy it any more effectively than it did Afghanistan. It's a false war. It's based on considerable Russian misinformation, which we will talk about, it really lays myth to the fact that the alleged might of the Russian army. In many ways, Russia has already lost this war. Its military has performed abysmally. Its logistics are inadequate. Its intelligence is bordering on the incompetent, or it is incompetent, and indeed the devastation and destruction and sheer brutality against Ukraine is absolutely unmatched. There are 3 million Ukrainian refugees. There are 6 million Ukrainians who are internally displaced, and much of Ukraine has been destroyed for absolutely no reason. What is of concern to me is the worse the Russian military does, the more brutal this war is likely to become. There's a genuine reason to fear that they will use chemical weapons, which they have done before. They have already used hypersonic missiles. Hypersonic missiles fly at such a great speed that there's no defense against them. There's a fear that they will use tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons are smaller than what we associate with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're battlefield weapons, but they cover a smaller area, but they nonetheless leave considerable radioactivity and destruction in their wake. And as Russia continues to perform badly, what it appears to be trying to do is to terrorize the population, to make war on the civilians of Ukraine, to create such chaos and such panic that the country is simply forced to concede. And President Zelensky, who is indeed a heroic figure of Churchillian magnitude, has repeatedly refused to surrender, and he is constantly admonishing Russia to engage in good faith negotiations. Who wins here? Oddly, the only winner in this war, it's not Russia, it's not Ukraine, it's not Europe, is China. And the reason I say China is able to sit on the sidelines, quietly support Russia, which it has been doing, and sort of act like the grown-up in the room, while all of these Western nations are involved in this brutal war, a war that didn't have to be. So what Russia is doing by this is empowering a country that it alleges to have a relationship with, but that it's more uncomfortable with probably than even the United States. Okay, where did this war come from? There were, I would say, two plausible explanations. Historically, Russia has always had a sort of envy-hate relationship with the West. This goes back to the time of Peter the Great, who made his visit to Germany and Western Europe and returned to Russia in awe of the technological development that he witnessed in the West. Any of you who have been to Russia, once you leave St. Petersburg or Moscow, it is a developing, underdeveloped, poor, and in many ways backward country, in large part because of the lack of conscientious leadership from Moscow. So this notion that the West presents sort of a threat to Russia always looms large in Putin's thinking. Also, the worst moment for Vladimir Putin, as he said on more than one occasion, was the destruction of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Empire, which included, if you look at the map, vast portions of Central Asia and Eastern Europe and the Baltics, was reduced to Russia, which has become a kleptocratic antithesis to democracy. With, as we've seen, a poor military, a struggling economy, the antithesis of democracy, and so forth. So a lot of this attack on Ukraine is rooted in Russian history. Russia also believes that when we say that we were on the same side as the Soviet Union during World War II, the Russians are well aware of the fact that World War II did not come to the U.S. homeland. It did come to the Russian/Soviet homeland, and they took massive, massive casualties. So they believe that they suffered improportionally during World War II compared to the United States and even part of Western Europe, which was occupied by the Nazis. The second piece of this is I would argue, is a consequence of our inattention to the consequences or the cost of winning the Cold War. There was a triumphal feeling in the United States and the West after we basically defeated the Soviet Union and won the Cold War. And the Soviets, the Russians, they felt diminished, they felt disrespected, they felt belittled. And indeed, in retrospect, we probably should have not just turned our back on them and treated them like losers, but actually try to empower them in a constructive way. I'm not saying we should have had a Marshall Plan costing billions of dollars, but we should have tried to establish a somewhat more positive partnership with Russia rather than treating them as being vanquished. And again, this is something that has undermined and deeply upset the Russian leadership and people since the end of the Cold War. It probably, in retrospect, would have behooved us had we been a somewhat more gracious winner. History doesn't give do-overs. It's not golf. There are no mulligans. But I think when we're trying to understand where this comes from, I think the Russian psyche is adversely affected by the outcome of the Cold War, which they richly deserved to lose. So they should have lost. It's just we might have handled it better. I now want to talk about three important perspectives on the war. The first is the fate and future of Ukraine. The second is the fate and future of Europe. And the third is the global implications of this war. Make no mistake about it, this war is the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. This is a 9/11 magnitude type event. This is of enormous consequences. This has only been going on for a month. I mean, it feels like forever, particularly for the poor Ukrainian people. But having said this, this is not likely to end quickly. I don't think that Putin, despite the miserable performance of his military, is likely to give up anytime soon. In these situations, everybody wants to claim victory and go home, and it would be very difficult at this point for Putin to do this. This is very different than the Iraq War. It's very different than the Afghanistan War. They were certainly important, but neither had the global implications that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has done. It is perilously close to taking on NATO. And as you know, Article 5 of NATO says that an attack on one is an attack on all. So if for some reason there are Russian promoted fatalities in Poland, which is a NATO member, the United States and all of the NATO members are committed to responding militarily to Russia. So the stakes here are very, very high. And what we will see is Putin foolishly created a self-fulfilling prophecy, which we will talk about. So again, Iraq and Afghanistan were somewhat more localized. This is a war with global implications. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese are watching very carefully. When we think Russia invading Ukraine, you can be sure that the Chinese and the Taiwanese are thinking about China invading Taiwan or attacking Taiwan. And again, another conversation perhaps another day is what have we learned about our readiness, our preparedness, our foresight, our planning, our alliance structure vis-a-vis what really is the main event in U.S. foreign policy, or was the main event, which is a menacing China and specifically Taiwan. And if you want in the questions, we can certainly talk about that. But people are talking Russia, Ukraine, but they're also thinking China, Taiwan, as they should. Ukraine, as I said earlier, will never be as it was before. It takes a matter of days to destroy a country. It can take a generation or more to restore it. The psychological implications, the emotional implications, what the children of Ukraine are going for, these tragic pictures of fathers taking their families to the Hungarian, the Moldovan, the Romanian, the Polish border, sending their families into refugeehood, refugee status, and then turning around, going back into Ukraine and fighting the Russians. So the emotional consequences of this war on the Ukrainian people is unimaginable. It is unimaginable, and Ukraine will not recover from this quickly. The second thing is simply the massive destruction. The massive destruction. Here is this beautiful country with these magnificent cities, Kyiv and others, simply destroyed. And the worse the Russian military has done, the more they have destroyed. The Russians actually thought they would sail in, overthrow the government, Zelensky would be arrested or would flee, and they would take over, put in a puppet government and leave. It didn't turn out that way. It didn't turn out that way. So physically, the infrastructure, the cities and the countryside will not be the same. What we are witnessing are war crimes. Putin is absolutely a war criminal, without a doubt. Not that this is causing him much sleep, but we've also seen how the Russians make war in Chechnya, in Syria, where they supported the Assad regime, and other places. That they do not play by a rule book that we would recognize. So the war crimes, the brutality, the naked aggression, millions of refugees, all to restore the Soviet Union back to its former glory. And this absolutely is not going to happen. You also, in a situation like this, see who your friends really are. Israel has not been as supportive of Ukraine as one might hope. They are not willing to sell them military equipment. They are offering to mediate, which is good, but they are fearful of offending Russia, with whom they have a good relationship. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, both were very reluctant to increase oil production to offset oil energy sources that were being curtailed as a result of this war. Ultimately, they agreed to do it, but it took longer than it should. India, which has a very unsettled relationship with Russia, was not willing to side with the rest of the global community against Russia in the United Nations. And frankly, the Ukrainians, I think, understand the United States is doing what it can. But as you know, the Ukrainians would like the United States to do more. And for better or for worse, we have decided that we cannot do more. Specifically, they want to create a no-fly zone, which I'll talk about. We are not willing to do this. What are the solutions to this war? And again, as I said earlier, a solution is something where the Russians will be able to say that they won, to withdraw. They may keep the Donbass, which is a Russian-speaking area of Ukraine. Think the Germans in Sudetenland. This is the 21st century equivalent of that. The pretext for this war was Russia saving the allegedly endangered, victims of genocide, which is absolutely ridiculous, Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine. That was the pretext for invading Ukraine, is to save these Russian-speaking people. I guarantee the Russian-speaking people will do better living under the government of a united Ukraine than they ever will living under the kleptocratic, corrupt, brutal government of Vladimir Putin. It's one solution is a Ukraine that is a smaller piece of its former self, the Russian-speaking areas are claimed by Russia. Russia either occupies them or puts in some sort of puppet government, and Ukraine is partitioned. Is it likely? Is it certain? I don't know, but this is something certainly that the Russians would like. Intermediaries, there are lots of them. Macron from France has been trying to negotiate between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Israelis have offered, because they have a good relationship with Moscow, to mediate, and President Bennett has offered to come to Kiev and to negotiate. Perhaps Israel will do it, because Israel does have a relationship with both. Frankly, I don't think Russia is looking for anybody to mediate. What Russia is looking for is some way to achieve their objectives, or to simulate having achieved their objectives, and then to withdraw. Finally, there is the no-fly debate, which I mentioned earlier. What the Ukrainians would like is for the United States to create a no-fly zone in which we would be able to control the skies over the Ukraine, which would slow down the Russian Air Force. As the ground war has stalled and the Russians have done worse and worse and worse, 6 Russian generals, allegedly, 5 or 6 have been killed on the ground combat in this war. You don't lose generals that quickly if you know what you're doing. So very quickly, this has morphed from being a ground war where the Russians are not doing well to an air war. And remarkably, miraculously, heroically, and almost unbelievably, the much smaller Ukrainian Air Force is to some degree keeping the Russians at bay. I was reading an interview with a Ukrainian pilot this morning in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, someplace. And when you're a fighter pilot, you go through all of these checks, you take off in an orderly way. There are all of these procedures. What this pilot said, he said he doesn't do any of the checks. He gets in the plane, he takes off the way we would drive, out of our driveway. He is instantly in combat. And the heroic performance of these pilots, the Ukrainian pilots, is remarkable. But the Russian Air Force is much larger. It has deeper equipment capabilities than Ukraine. And they've taken the war to the sky. And to compensate for where the Ukrainians have done pretty well against them, they have started launching ordnance from Russian territory. In other words, missiles that are shot from Russia into Ukraine, largely because that's beyond the reach of the Ukrainian Air Force. The no-fly zone, the United States is unwilling to do it, largely because they believe that if we establish a no-fly zone, an American pilot, a Polish pilot, a French pilot, a German, whatever it is, will engage directly with a Russian pilot. There will be fatalities, and this could lead to war between NATO and Russia. If there was war between NATO from Russia, or even the United States and Russia, I have no doubt that the United States or the West would win militarily. The problem is that when you engage in war with a nuclear power like Russia, and that nuclear power is losing, as Russia inevitably will, because their equipment and training is so inferior to ours, the stakes become higher, and there is always the possibility that they will resort to nuclear weapons. Is this an absolute guarantee? No. Is it a certainty? No. Are we exaggerating by fearing that? How do you exaggerate the fear of nuclear war? And something that has never happened and that is unimaginable. So this is the reason that the United States and NATO are not willing to consider a no-fly zone. What they have been talking about is transferring planes and equipment, including former Soviet equipment, to the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are familiar with Soviet equipment and would be able to use it. And indeed, there is former Soviet equipment that the United States has in its stockpile, which we got during and after the Cold War to study the Soviet military capability, some of which is stored in the US, which we are indeed sending to the Ukrainians. So, will this mean they will decisively win? No. Is it as powerful as a no-fly zone? No, but it lowers the risk of nuclear war. Because again, the worse the Russians do, the more likely they are to raise the stakes. Now they are brutally attacking civilians. It is very likely they will use chemical weapons, and it's certainly a possibility that they would go nuclear. So that's really the concern. There are global economic consequences from this war. Just give you a couple of examples. This is unlike, as I was saying earlier, Iraq and Afghanistan. Ukraine is sort of the breadbasket for much of Europe and other places. Egypt buys vast amounts of grain from Ukraine and from Russia, which it subsidizes to a huge degree. The average Egyptian pays about 1/5 the real cost of grain, which the Egyptian government heavily subsidizes in order to promote political stability. Access to that grain has disappeared. So the cost of grain has gone through the roof. Could this lead to a revolution or a civil war or unrest in Egypt? Certainly a possibility. It's certainly a possibility if the Egyptian people feel drawn to it. Energy, we know about. You just go to the pump, and gas here in California is over $6 a gallon. Inflation is very high. So this is likely to lead to all sorts of political consequences. There may be U.S. political consequences. One former American president referred to Vladimir Putin as a genius. Another former U.S. Secretary of State said that Vladimir Putin is elegant. And there are elements in this country that are in the United States that are siding with Putin and saying, someone who's running for the Senate in Ohio said, I don't care about Ukraine. Well, that's certainly his right. But again, there are divisions here. There may be political consequences. Lindsey Graham said that Putin should be assassinated. His fellow senators disagreed with that. And frankly, I get it. It's the kind of thing, one might say in the privacy of their home. But yeah, political assassination by governments goes in both directions. And the Russians have a notorious history of assassinating political opponents. So I don't think it's as satisfying as it would be. I don't think this is the route that we want to take publicly. So again, there are political consequences of this war, both domestically and globally. And again, if you look at the cost of gas, inflation, supply chains, and so forth, this war has implications for all of us, most for the poor Ukrainian people, but the rest of the world is involved as well. In terms of Russia, I can see a situation in which Russia can win the battle and lose the war. What do I mean by that? Russia will negotiate with Ukraine. Ukraine will reluctantly give out the Donbass and the other Russian-speaking areas, possibly. Russia will occupy, them or create puppet governments. But on the other hand, this has been a self-fulfilling prophecy for Putin. Sweden and Finland are talking about joining NATO. Sweden walked that back and said they're not thinking about it. But believe me, if you're the head of state in any of these countries, you are thinking about Russia in a different way. Norway, which shares a border with Russia, which people don't generally realize. If you go to the very top of Norway, you'll see up in the Arctic, the Russian-Norwegian border. So NATO is without a doubt going to be moving its equipment and its troops closer to the Russian border. Germany is going to dramatically increase its defense expenditures. NATO, which again, some former president said is irrelevant, is not only irrelevant, it's more relevant now than it has been in years. And NATO has learned the lessons from this, and the NATO member states are going to increase their defense expenditures. That's not what Putin wanted. That's what Putin is going to get. Switzerland, which has a time-honored policy of neutrality, has sided against Russia and abandoned its traditional notion of neutrality. And again, back to our friends in Beijing, looking at Taipei, looking at Hong Kong, what will give the Chinese pause is the speed and efficacy within which the West united. Within a matter of days, the Russians were attacking Ukraine, and the West unified itself in a remarkable way. In terms of boycotting Russia, punishing these Russian oligarchs who are all crooks. You don't make the kind of money that these people made as quickly as they do without being dishonest. And this is not a Jeremiah against wealth. It's an observation about Russian oligarchs, which is very, very different than more legitimate wealth generation throughout the rest of the world. So Russia is going to get squeezed by NATO. The West is more unified than it has ever been. The West has sided against Russia in a profound and powerful way. And Russia, as I say, may win the battle. They may get something tangible in Ukraine, but they are going to lose the war because the West is simply not going to let this pass. And from a Chinese perspective, Russia, which was always a weak junior partner to China, may become even more indebted to China, which you can be sure Putin, who is this arrogant megalomaniac, is likely to bitterly resent. Russia does not want to be China's very junior partner, which it certainly can be. Also, domestically at home, Putin is weakened. There are considerable demonstrations in Russia. Alexei Navalny, who is the unbelievably courageous leading opponent of Putin, was just resentenced to an additional 13 years in prison rather than 2. And this is the guy Putin tried to assassinate him. He survived the assassination, and then he went back to Russia, which is just mind-boggling to me. He was put into a very brutal prison, and he still has the courage to stand up to Putin. What Navalny's people say is, we don't care how long Navalny is sentenced to prison because Putin is going to be overthrown and he's going to be released. And who knows? Could one of Putin's own people take him out? Anything is possible. But when you see these news clips of Putin sitting at a table, and then 50 yards away are his staff or the person he's talking to, this is not only COVID protection, it also suggests that this guy, wants some distance between himself and everybody else, which is a real problem. As much as Russian media is trying to repurpose and recast this war in a way that's promoting Russian patriotism, in this day and age with cellular telephones and the ability, the World Wide Web, and all sorts of other stuff, people in Russia know what's going on. I was in a hotel. I was in the Middle East last week. I just got back, and I was in a hotel in Dubai, which was full of Russian tourists. Not oligarchs own hotels. Tourists stay at hotels. These were well-to-do Russian tourists. And I was speaking to one of the employees of the hotel. They only have 4 Russian speakers, one of whom is Ukrainian. And she was, the quintessential professional and was respectful to the Russian guests despite her inclinations otherwise. But she was telling us that the Russians are outraged. Why? They can't use their credit cards. They've been cut off from the global economy. So, the inconvenience, as well as the emotional humiliation of being, the outcast of the global community, is likely to impinge on their loyalty to Putin and to Mother Russia. So I do think that as he cranks up repression, there are certainly possibilities that he will be weakened at home. Finally, I want to talk about the global situation, and then I want to open it up for questions. As I said earlier, what we're witnessing with Russia is most certainly a metaphor for China. And as we're trying to think globally and talk about global strategy, it's important for us to be attentive to what China did in Hong Kong. A poor deal was made at Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is as we know it or remember it, is very gradually being destroyed and turning into another piece of China run by Beijing rules, not by Hong Kong rules. And there is increasing attention to Taiwan because the world realizes that it may not be ready for Taiwan. So the whole notion of Western unity, the Chinese Belt and Road Project, which is China lending money and doing projects around the world to promote itself, I think it's becoming increasingly visible. I watched the hearings. The new U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica is a member of my organization, now Ambassador Cynthia Tejas, who's a professor at UCLA. I watched Professor Tejas' confirmation hearing for ambassador with 2 other candidates who were also to be ambassadors. Most of the questions to Ambassador Tejas were about China's role in Costa Rica. So we need to begin to think about China as a global actor. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine has just changed everything. The United States has been involved in direct negotiations with Venezuela, which is the bad boy of the Western Hemisphere. It used to be Cuba. Cuba is kind of in fits and starts, moving, in a different direction. We've had nothing to do with Venezuela, but Venezuela is used to be and could be again a major oil producer. So the United States has been talking to Venezuela again to offset Russian oil production. Venezuela just released 2 American hostages who they've held for years. So this whole war with Ukraine has changed things. Second is in my view, the limited power of economic instruments. Economic sanctions hurt, but they rarely kill. There have been economic sanctions against Iran for years and years and years. Iran has withstood them. There are now economic sanctions against Russia. They hurt. They are painful. Russian tourists can't use their credit card when they're on vacation in Dubai. And worse than that, do nations capitulate as a result of economic sanctions? Probably not. So the utility and power of economic warfare is rather limited. And I think that's something that we are learning from this war. The next thing is the refugee crisis. Once refugees leave home, they often don't go back. They often don't go back. Refugees don't leave their homes lightly. They leave their homes because the life in their home community is untenable. And there are refugees for all sorts of reasons. There are environmental refugees because of climate change, places where people who live generally an agrarian existence, as water becomes increasingly scarce and non-existent, they can no longer farm, they can no longer feed their families, they leave. They leave. There are economic refugees, for other reasons that the levels, even if you're not a farmer, but you're living in the city, the economy is very, very bad, you will leave. There are political refugees, people from parts of Africa and Afghanistan and Iraq and Central America, people leaving political oppression, which is not only unpleasant, but can be lethal. And then there are finally refugees that are a result of war. And there are more refugees in the world today than at any time in modern history. So the whole refugee crisis is not going to go away. 3 million Ukrainian refugees, 6 million displaced people. What's going to happen to these 3 million people? Are they simply going to go home once the battles are over? I'm not so sure. So all of the countries that are housing them, their futures are going to be very different as a consequence of their generosity, their kindness, their compassion, but also life in these places is likely to change. And then finally, geopolitical arrangements. The Iran nuclear deal, which the United States has been negotiating, and it's not a unilateral or bilateral U.S.-Iranian deal. It's the United States, Germany, France, Great Britain, China, and Russia have all negotiated this together. The Russians have said the only way they will support the Iran nuclear negotiation is if their trade with Iran is not subject to a lot of the economic sanctions which we've imposed, and we have said no. Frankly, I don't have much confidence in the Iran nuclear deal, so if it tanks, I don't think that's terrible. But having said that, it shows you how the international system issues and the like are interlocked in a very important way. And then finally, to end with the grim economic, and then we can open it for questions, supply chains, oil prices, inflation, space research. Believe it or not, we have collaborative space projects, the United States and Russia. Will those continue? What are they going to look like? And finally, democracy. Democracy was already under threat in a lot of places in the world, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Turkey, and numerous other countries. So what are the implications of democracy as a consequence of the situation that we find ourselves in? The United States is not the world leader. We are not the global policeman. But having said that, I shudder to think about a world without American leadership would look like. So that doesn't mean we're responsible for everything, but it does say that we have a responsibility to ourselves and those who share our values to make our voice heard and to stand by our values. Let me end by thanking you all for your attention and your patience. I'm happy to, Nicole, I guess, will field the questions. I really do believe that our thoughts and prayers and actions need to be with the Ukrainian people. And I think it's very, very important. So thank you so much. Nicole, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Jerry. So I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to type in your questions in the top right corner of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can today. Jerry, the first question is, how long, in your opinion, do you think this conflict is likely to last?
Sadly, it's hard to imagine. This conflict has only been going on for a month. Putin will not stand down unless he can fool his people and some segment of the rest of the world that he has actually achieved some objectives and that he has won. Every time Zelensky says let's negotiate, let's find an end to this, I think Putin reads into this some degree of weakness and some willingness on the part of the Ukrainians to be conciliatory. So this could go on for a long, long time. And what I find particularly disheartening is the worse the Russians do, the more they increase the levels of brutality, fatality, and indifference to the suffering of the civilian population, who are targeted every bit as much as military targets are targeted. And this is simply wrong. This is simply wrong. But again, Putin is coming to the game with some considerable liabilities. And even as I said earlier, once the immediate combat is over, this can still continue, because what happens to the refugees? Do they go home? Where do they live? In other words, all of the consequences of this are likely to last for a long time. But I do think that the formal combat is far from over, and it can get far, far worse. Think chemical, think biological, think nuclear, and even worse, direct combat with NATO.
Great, thank you. We have another question, and I think this is on everybody's mind. What's the likelihood that there will be a World War III?
It's my fear about a World War III is Putin, out of desperation, doing something that leaves us no alternative. Because what he's been trying to do is for quite a while, it's sort of false flag activities. In other words, he will try and do something and then say Ukraine did it. So he will use chemical weapons and say, Ukraine used chemical weapons, we need to use chemical weapons. And one of the things that the Biden administration has done that I think was quite prudent in my view is we have released intelligence. Generally, intelligence is very close hold. It's held very, very closely. We don't want to reveal our intelligence for a whole variety of reasons. In this case, much of the intelligence we got, we released immediately, so that it would be more difficult for Putin to mount, as it's called, a false flag effort. In other words, to say Ukraine did this, but in fact Russia did this. And by saying Ukraine did it, it allows the Russians to up the ante and to blame the Ukrainians. The likelihood of World War III is certainly there. I mean, in theory, there could be combat between the United States, NATO, and Russia that would not lead to World War III. But what I fear is that, and I'm not a psychotherapist, so I don't like to use words like unhinged, crazy, irrational, or even crazy like a fox. I mean, it's impossible to peer into people's brains. But I do know that as Putin, assuming he is painted into a corner, and the fewer options he has, and the less likely he can portray this as a victory, even if it's not, the more desperate he will become, the less he has to lose, and the more he can up the ante against us. And the likelihood of accidents is always considerable in situations like this. People are really, really frightened. I was talking to some young person yesterday, and he said, do you think I should buy a house? And I'm not a realtor, but I know exactly what he was asking about. Is the world going to come to an end? I mean, people, even, in this country, are feeling the implications of this war, at the gas pump and, supply chains and, all of these sorts of things. But I would not dismiss out of hand the possibility of World War III, but I also don't think it's particularly likely. But it's certainly, the Pentagon plans for every contingency. The day that Peru, I'm making this up, Peru invades Iceland, there is a contingency at the Pentagon to deal with something that will never happen. Is World War III a contingency? Absolutely. How likely is it? I don't think very, but it's not a complete improbability. And again, dealing with Putin is very, very difficult. And this is not something that just happened. It is very deep within the Russian psyche. I took it back to the Cold War, and then I took it back to Peter the Great. So what's going on culturally and in his mind and psychologically is very different than what's going on with us in the West, because he has his history, we have ours. His history is driving this in a way that's different than with the U.S. and the West.
Great. So you mentioned some of the immediate implications that the Russian people are experiencing and the Putin government is experiencing. What are your views on the long-term consequences for Russia?
I would like to believe, and this may be wishful thinking, that Russia is a country with enormous potential and enormous gifts which have been squandered. It is a kleptocracy. And when I say, what do I mean by a kleptocracy? You know, Putin is surrounded by a bunch of his thug-like friends who are these oligarchs with whom he made sweetheart deals, selling state resources after the fall of the Soviet Union for pennies on the dollar, and then selling them back to the state for dollars on the dollar. Things of that sort. I mean, massive, massive corruption and inattention, A, to democracy, and B, to the development of Russia outside the main urban centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It is my hope that the Russian people are paying increasing attention to how they are perceived, not the Russians as a people, but their government and their country is being perceived by the rest of the world as an outlaw country run by a renegade regime that is destroying Russia and undermining its global role in this, pathetic attempt to create the Soviet Union, which itself was deeply, deeply flawed. This desire by Putin for empire, suggests that the Soviet Union was so wonderful. The Soviet Union was lost the Cold War because it wasn't wonderful. Its economy is failing. Its vassal states didn't want to live under Soviet rule. They wanted freedom the way Ukraine has, or Georgia, or Moldova, or Kazakhstan, or Uzbekistan. I mean, you sort of look at the former Russian Empire. So one hopes that the Russian people will stand up, demand democracy, demand an end to the kleptocracy, and demand an end to Putin. Would you want your child dying, on this war of aggression against Ukraine that didn't have to happen? It didn't have to happen. This is a sheer war of aggression. That's it. There was nothing at stake for Russia other than its own ego and the pathetic ambitions of Putin. So this is what I hope will happen. If, I could certainly be wrong. His oppression of the Russian people is continuing. It's not diminishing. Lots of young Russians are leaving because they don't want to live there, but lots of young Russians are also standing up. So this is perhaps wishful thinking rather than a prediction that you should regard with complete confidence.
Yeah, speaking of, the Putin government, are there any Russian individuals that you feel could replace Putin in a positive way?
Oh, absolutely. I can't give you names because, it's one of the things that Putin has done is anybody who has a reasonable expectation of replacing him, has been, pushed into the limelight, thrown in prison, or chased out of the country. But this is an enormously talented country populated by enormously talented people. And, many people look to Alexei Navalny, who's in prison. But if it's not Navalny, there could be lots of others. What we had hoped would happen is after and this is really where I think we missed the boat. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the creation of a genuine democracy in Russia. Unfortunately, it did not happen. And Russia slid from one flavor of dictatorship or autocracy into another flavor. And one hopes that the Russian people realize how much they are being victimized by the ambitions of Putin. The consequences for their children, be it dying on the battlefield of Ukraine or living in this kleptocratic dictatorship in the years to come.
Great. So we have time for a few more questions here. So I just want to remind the audience to go ahead and enter your questions in that top right corner of your screen. So Jerry, the next question, any ideas about what other nations of the world might be able to do to prevent or quickly stop the types of war and war crimes occurring in the Ukraine now and previously gotten away with in Syria?
It's a great question. And tragically, we always end up fighting the last war. And there was a strong suspicion that Putin was going to invade. And indeed, the prediction turned out to be correct. And the only thing to say, to credit the West, the US and the French and the Germans, is the West unified very, very quickly against Russia. NATO, which its value is questioned, is now of unquestionable value. The China-Taiwan metaphor. And what we hope will happen is that the same mistakes will not be made vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. We see what China has in mind simply by looking at Hong Kong. They've given us the answers, and we keep hoping, it's going to turn out better. It's going to, there are no secrets. There's no mystery. They're not lying. What they've done in Hong Kong is precisely what they're going to do in Taiwan. So I think this is the time to be thinking I just joined a task force on the future of U.S.-Taiwanese relations, which will be jet propelled by what's happening in Ukraine. In terms of the very specific question that was just asked, what can we do to help Ukraine? And in a sense, I don't want to say it's too late, because it's not too late, but much of the damage has happened. So the question is, how do we extricate ourselves from this? And I think Western resolve and commitment, and I don't have access to all the classified information, but I hope, what I read in the press and hear from talking to friends and others, we are sending massive amounts of assistance to the Ukrainians. We need to be doing that, including intelligence, including media, including Western support for Zelensky and his government, and ongoing commitment. We don't want, the imagination of the public will lose interest in this in month 2 or 3 or 4. We really need to keep the pressure up on Putin and our support for Zelensky. I have something I printed and I put over my desk in my office at home where I am, and we offered to extricate Zelensky. The U.S. said to Zelensky, "Look, your life is in danger. We're going to get, we're happy to get you out of Ukraine." And Zelensky said, "I need ammunition, not a ride." And there is something in that very simple phrase that, as I said earlier, is Churchillian. What remarkable courage. We need to stand up for the Ukrainian people and to support him to the best of our ability. We need to admit Ukrainian refugees to the U.S. So far, the numbers are very, very small, whereas Poland is accepting massive numbers of Ukrainians. And we need to stay in this until it's over.
Jerry, you mentioned earlier in the presentation, the economic sanctions on Russia. If these economic sanctions are ineffective, how can the West stop Russia?
I think they're effective, but they're not as effective as we would like to think. In other words, they are never, what we've learned is economic sanctions are a powerful weapon or a powerful tool, but in and of themselves, they don't get the job done. I was in Iran a few years ago after major sanctions had been in place for a long time. And I was driving north to Tehran from Shiraz, which is in the south, and I kept seeing these trucks bringing large numbers of Chinese-made automobiles from the south to the north. So everywhere there's a sanction, there is a sanctions buster. And every time, there's a mousetrap, there's somebody is trying to outwit the mousetrap. So I think we need to maintain the sanctions. I just don't think we can delude ourselves in believing in and of themselves they will do the job. One of the things that really impressed me is how quickly we stepped up and began to impose and apply the sanctions against these oligarchs, many of whom may have Putin's personal funds or are supporting him. And so we absolutely need to keep up the pressure, without a doubt, and we need to ramp it up. But having said that, that in and of itself is not going to do the job. There are other tools that we need to use as well.
All right, so we have time for one last question before we wrap it up here. So the question is, if drones and artillery shells continue to fall onto NATO territory, how do you think NATO will respond?
Well, that's the question. If they fall on NATO territory, and NATO chooses to respond, which they may, this puts us head to head with the Russians. This brings NATO goes to war with Russia. Again, Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. So what the questioner just asked is a real possibility, and the consequences of that are profound. And then the question is, what are the consequences of that? Will this push Russia to go nuclear? Will this push them to go chemical? And we don't know. We can't say. But it is a very, very considerable risk. Frankly, part of me would love the United States to take on Russia militarily, because we would wipe the floor with them. I mean, their military is so backward, is so underdeveloped. But, after overcoming my, immediate disgust with Putin and bullies and all of that stuff, then the more cold, calculating analyst part of me kicks in. And what our questioner just asked, this is what's keeping the lights burning at the Pentagon and the White House and Whitehall and the Quai d'Orsay and, all over the world every day, every night. How far can we go to achieve our objectives without going farther than we would like to go? And no one can answer that question. Anybody who claims they can, just keep walking. They can't. But that's the question we're all asking ourselves, and we're asking one another. So it's a frustrating but fitting question to end our conversation with this afternoon.
Yes, thank you, Jerry. We had a lot of great questions, and I apologize to anybody whose question we didn't get to today. On behalf of Whittier Trust, we thank you, Jerry, and the Pacific Council on International Policy for your time today. And thank you to the audience members for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.